Welcome back to CamBro Conversations. Today's conversation, I'm diving into all things personal finance with Nick Maggiulli. Nick, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
And I think when I was researching for this episode, Nick, you've done so many podcast interviews. You've got your book, which is incredible, but you've also got years and years of blog articles, which I was combing through, trying to gain all the different knowledge that was needed. And you've covered so many important topics. And one of those was on the 12th of April in 2017, you wrote a blog titled Just Keep Buying. 5 years later, almost in some sort of freaky coincidence, you released a book by the same name. What happened in the intervening period that made you want to turn that blog article into a book?
I just did a lot of research on finance. And so every week I was basically, trying to write about different things in personal finance and investing. And I was using data to do it. And I think in late 2020, once we had, I think this was like the third big COVID wave. The first big one was in New York. The second big one, at least in the United States, happened after that. Like after Memorial Day, there was a big wave. I thought after those two things had happened, I'm like, okay, guys, it's over. We had, we flattened the curve, right? And I was very wrong, obviously. So after that the third big wave in December 2020, I started getting very pessimistic. I'm like, we're going to be trapped in here forever. So I might as well use this time. And I have enough material now that I think I can put together a kind of money philosophy and kind of guide people and help as much as possible. And so that's why the book covers personal finance and it covers investing. Most books out there don't cover both topics, or they'll cover one and kind of just briefly touch on the other. But I feel like I was able to get enough good data and really kind of dive deep into each one of these things in a way that I haven't seen done before. So I think that's kind of my main takeaway here is like, I'm trying to help people with their personal finances, saving, budgeting, all that type of stuff. I don't talk about budgeting too much, but some of the other things in there. And I'm also trying to help people figure out, like, how do I invest my money? What should I be doing at the same time?
Yeah, and at a time where people are more panicked than ever before, I think if you were to time a book release titled Just Keep Buying, it probably couldn't have gone any better in terms of timing, Nick.
Yeah, funny when I announced that I was releasing it. So I announced the pre-orders back in September 2021. And the thing that people say is like, oh, this is a sign at the top, right? Like, because you're saying just keep buying at the top. And I was like, I didn't write it for the bull market. I actually wrote it for the bear market. And I think my favorite chapter in the book is chapter 17, which is, how to buy during a crisis, basically. Like, what do you do when, markets are really in dire straits? And I think that's the chapter to read and focus on for anyone who's like really worried about markets right now, because, what I rely on is history. At the end of the day, like that's the only thing we have. Of course, history is imperfect. History is not going to repeat itself in the same way, but it's going to rhyme in ways. And that rhyming is kind of what's important here. So
it's funny, you actually wrote in that blog in 2017 that you'd only ever invested in a bull market up until that point. I think you said you started investing in 2009, and then we had that kind of brilliant decade, particularly if you were invested in the S&P 500 between that time and probably up until the Ukraine war. You were laughing all the way to the returns bank. But how have you found your ability to follow your own advice when the market has been so negative recently?
I haven't changed anything. Still doing the same stuff, buying the same frequency I normally buy. I haven't changed anything about my strategy. The only thing I can understand why people might be a little worried right now is bonds. I mean, bonds have had a pretty bad year. It's already kind of too late for that. Like, oh, I wish I had less bonds earlier in the year. But besides that, I still think people should own bonds. The question is how much and what's the right amount, especially with yields as low as they are. They don't have the same value prop that they had 30, 40 years ago, right? And so because yields are low and they've obviously sold off a bunch, it's very interesting to see what's going to happen. But I do think it's useful for risk. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think for a lot of my listeners who are like at that early stage, they maybe use like a Vanguard account and you can pick like a split between equities and bonds. And the higher the split between, or so the higher the bias towards bonds, the safer or more long-term your kind of approach. But at the moment, like you say, like it's a little bit daunting to see how poorly the bonds are performing in that respect. But then everything's performing poorly as well.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about safer, I think the question is safer when, right? Safer over the next year for sure. Safer over the next 30 years, no. I would say it's the opposite. I would say like 100% stock portfolio is going to be far safer over a 30-year period than a 60-40 portfolio, because bonds they don't grow as much over time. So over a 30-year period, assuming you were putting money into a box and you have to come back in 30 years, what's going to be the safer bet? In my opinion, it's going to be a global equity portfolio. Then it's going to be some sort of like global stock, equity plus fixed income bond portfolio, right? So I guess when we talk about safety, we need to talk about the time scale, because that's everything, right? And obviously, I'm not saying that doesn't matter, of course, to get to that 30 years. I mean, if you just had to put the money in, you couldn't take it out. Yeah, 100% equity portfolio is going to do probably fine for you. But given you can look in the box every day and you can see the value and you can trade and you can take money out of the box, right? That's what a brokerage account is. Then it does change things. And that's where bonds do, help people from, panicking, basically.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you mentioned people looking in the box all the time, I think some people have almost during this period looked in the box so often that it's like frightened them in a way that if they had just switched off and come back again in 3-4 years' time, they might be a lot calmer about the situation.
Yeah, it also depends what they have in the box, right? If the box is a globally diversified portfolio of income producing assets such as equities, stocks, real estate, etc., that's one thing. If the box is high flying tech stocks, like 90% tech, leveraged, NASDAQ or crypto or something like that, you're going to feel very differently, right? And so it's just a matter of concentrating risk and how much risk do you want to take. And so I have no idea if, the NASDAQ's going to come back in a huge way. I think it will. To what extent, I don't know. I don't know if we're going to see valuations like we saw in 2021 anytime soon, but I do think there will be some recovery in parts of this market. The question is when, and no one knows when.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned chapter 17 was a standout chapter for you. One of the concepts that you raised that kind of interested me the most, I don't think it's probably thought about enough, was the save invest continuum. Can you share that with us just now?
Yeah. So basically, when I tell people where to focus their time in their financial life, I like to think about this on a continuum. And everyone's on the continuum. It's a question of where you are. And all you need to know where you are on the save invest continuum is just you need two numbers, right? The first number is how much can you save in the next year reasonably. So for example, let's say you can save $500 or 500 pounds or whatever a month. So you do that over the next year, that's $6,000, 6,000 pounds, whatever. That's your first number, 6,000. The second number is how much can your investments generate for you over the next year? For someone who doesn't have anything invested, the answer is zero, right? But let's say you had 20 grand invested. Let's say you expect, I don't know, a 5% return. Okay. That's $1,000 or 1,000 pounds, whatever. So your first number is 6,000. Your second number is 1,000. Which one's bigger? That's where you need to focus. So in this case, because the 6,000 is bigger, you need to focus on taking that $6,000, saving it, and then getting it invested to raise the other number, right? Because now imagine after a year, you don't have $26,000 invested. Instead of it giving you $1,000, it's going to give you, 5% of 26,000, which is obviously a little more than that, right? Something like maybe, 1,030 or something like that. I'm not going to do the math in my head, but you get the point, right? The point is, over time, you should see these numbers shift, right? When you're 65 and you can't work anymore, your amount you can save is basically zero, but your investments are going to be earning you money still in theory, right? So the whole idea is like, find out where you are on this path, right? Focus there so that you can kind of get the other number higher. If you're very young or you just started saving, it's very likely that you can save more money than you can invest, than your investments would return you. So you need to focus on getting that money invested to raise that number. So I'm at a point now where in a given year, and because I've been working for 10 years and saving very diligently for 10 years, in a given year, they're about the same. The amount of money I can save from my career and my income and labor income is about the same as the amount of money that my investments will earn me in a year. Now, I think for most people, that'll happen about halfway, about 20, after 10 to 20 years of working, you'll start to see that kind of that transition point where now your investments are earning you more than you can save yourself. But it happens for everyone differently. I happen to get lucky. As I said, I've been investing since like 2012. So I really invested during a bull market. I was very diligent with my savings. And so I was very lucky and fortunate in that regard. But it's to the point where now, like I could, in a year, in like a bad year, like right now, we're down to something 20%, whatever it is in the markets at this point, at the time of this recording, that I've lost more money on paper than I could save in a year, right? And it's kind of crazy to think that, to be like, wow, I've lost more money than I've been able to save in a year. But that's kind of what you should expect to happen. And if you do this really well, you're going to lose more money in a bad year when there's some volatility. You're going to lose it on paper than you could save in 5 years or something. And that's what you should expect.
Because that's because how much you have staked in the market because you've invested over since 2012, you said. So I think that's such an important point, because you could spend all this time, if you've got, like you say, a few £1,000s that you're able to invest each year, you could spend all your time trying to chase 5, 10, 15, 20% returns. But that's negligible if you're not saving more and more money over time and compounding that in terms of, after 5 years, you've got that £6,000 times 5, you've got 30K, and you can actually have an impact in terms of gaining 10% on that is 3K. Whereas, like you say, it's so funny how we can concentrate on the small thing, like, oh, I want to pick this stock or this fund, but can you increase that £500 that you're saving each month through your day job, your side hustle, whatever it is, to try and get up to £600, £700, £1,000 a month? Because then you really move the dial in terms of how much you're putting into the market each time.
Yeah, exactly. I think the main takeaway here is most people that are doing this stock picking type stuff. I mean, not the professionals that are managing billions of dollars. That's very different. But like most individual investors like you and I, they would be better suited to go and get a second job or something. And they're going to make more money off of that than they would off of their stock picks. And the example you give is perfect. Like, let's say you have $1,000 invested. If you increase your annual return from 10 to 20%, don't get me wrong, that's great. That's, instead of making $100 on your investment, you're making 200. But that's only $100, like, or £100 or whatever. It's like you could make that way more easily in a week, or maybe even a couple shifts, it depending on what you do, like very easily after tax than you could do spending a year of doing research or whatever. It's just silly, right? Now, obviously, if you have $10 million invested, that's very different, right? Like a difference in 10% on $10 million is $1 million, right? So it really depends on how much money you have invested. I think there's a lot of people that are obsessed with this stuff when it's not necessary, right? For most people. And I think most people shouldn't be, trying to pick stocks, beat the market, all that. But if you're going to do it, you should only do it if you have actual money to, make it worth it. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it at all? You might as well just go get a second job where you'll make way more money.
Yeah. Daniel Crosby recently on the podcast, and he was the author of Behavioral Finance. You've maybe done his podcast as well, because when you've been doing your
ours is actually released today. Funny enough, it was released today, the day of this recording. Yeah, mine.
I'm looking forward to listening to that. I really like Daniel as a guest, but also as a host. And he was saying that he has a phrase, sin a little, so he doesn't sin a lot. So out of his investments, he probably invests about 3% in, like, he didn't say YOLO bets, but like he has a bit more fun in terms of, like, he's like, oh, that one might be a flyer, let's invest in that, while fully cognizant that it could, of course, go to zero in that particular investment. What's your own approach, Nick? Are you do you have that, like, a little bit of sinning within your portfolio?
Of course, yeah. I mean, that's a Cliff Asness idea. I think I was the first person to come up with. He has a post called Sin a Little, and that's basically the idea there. It's like, yeah, I put, for example, last year I put 1% of my portfolio into individual stocks. I had another like 0.5 to 1% in like some crypto altcoins, not Bitcoin and Ethereum. That I actually had like, I think 2 to 3% of my net worth in. But yeah, I had like 0.5% in some like altcoins, so it's not a lot of money, but I did that, and obviously those are doing bad. Those particular things are doing badly because those were tech stocks and altcoins. But it's like 2% of my net worth is doing badly, and the other percent, the other 90 something percent is not doing great, but it's not down 70-80%, right? So I didn't take catastrophic losses for most of my portfolio. I did take catastrophic losses in parts of that portfolio, right? So I think that's the thing to keep in mind, is like, where are you taking losses? How big is it? How big is your exposure? Like, if the S&P 500 is down 70%, then stuff like crypto and all that's going to be down much worse, in my opinion. I can't see a world where those assets are down a ton, like the big, mainstay assets are down a ton, yet crypto's up a ton, right? In the same time period. It just seems like when risk hits, it hits the most risky stuff first, and then it flows down from there.
Yeah, I would certainly agree, and I think that's reflected when anyone's opening their app. And I think it's funny when you say like things like 1% and Daniel says 3%, because a lot of people don't actually calculate what that means. They'll be like, oh, I'm going to chuck £1,000 or £1,000 into this stock, and you're like, well, actually, you only invested like £6,000 across the entire year. £1,000 is quite a big chunk of that. It's a sixth. Like, what you're not like playing sin a little to sin so you don't sin a lot there. You're actually sinning a lot, because you're going to get burnt if it doesn't take a flyer.
Yeah, exactly. In that case, that's what 16.67% of your portfolio is in, and of course that's still relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but at the same time, and also, like, you can beat yourself up over stuff like that. But once again, let's get back to the absolute dollar values. It's $1,000. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying $1,000 is nothing, but even if that went to zero, you could earn that back, right? We're not talking about exorbitant amounts of money. If that's 100,000, that's very different, right? But for most people, $1,000 can be a lot. But like, if you have $6,000 to invest, like, you got to go out there and, you got to earn more. Then you got to out earn your stupid investment mistake. And that's fine. You can do it, but it's something you might have to just spend a little extra time picking up extra shifts or doing something to make up for that.
Agreed. I actually referenced your blog when I spoke with Katie Gatti about, and it sounds like such an obvious piece of data, but it's so important that we acknowledge it. And that is that basically the more you earn, the more you can save. So I think it was something like the top percentage of earners that earn over 175K a year in the US, they invest more than 50% of their income because their living costs, it's actually quite hard to get your living costs up over that 50% threshold. So of course they're putting loads more into the market. So when people are worried about like, oh, how can I invest more into the market and create more leverage and compound faster over time, the answer is very similar to what you said there. Take on more shifts, increase your income, improve your value to your organization, or improve the value of your business or the income of your business. And that's a much quicker path towards financial freedom than pushing on which stock is going to take the best run in this next market.
Yeah, I would say it's quicker than that. I mean, I think the quickest thing you really can do is cut your spending, but it's not sustainable. It's not something you want to do. I don't recommend that approach. Technically, it's quicker because it's immediate. I can literally stop spending money. It's like fasting or something, right? You can, oh, fasting is a really difficult diet. No, it isn't. Just don't eat. I mean, you just don't eat. It's literally like you don't have to do anything. You have to do less stuff, actually. I'm not saying it's easy to do that, but that's like what you do. You don't eat. You don't spend money. It's the same thing, but it's not sustainable for a lot of people. I think that's why these things are difficult. So the most sustainable way to build wealth, as you said, is raise your income over time, whether that could take a few years. For example, my business, which I own, of Dollars and Data LLC, which owns the blog, has all the book income, all that stuff going through there. When I first started that thing, it made $3,000 in a year off affiliate links, which is not a ton of money, right? But still, it was something. And now it's making much, much more than that. But it took years. For the first 3 years, I made nothing. And then I the trickle came in, and then all of a sudden I started running ads, and it just kind of grew from there. So it's one of those things where it can take years to do it, but if you love something and you're willing to spend that time, you can do it. I think I took the slow path. I know people like, man, I went from 0 to 100K in revenue in 2 years, and that's amazing. And that's much faster than I did. It took me, much, much longer to get to anything even close to that, so just keep that in mind.
I'm glad you raised the spending point as well, Nick, because I think there is some personal finance advice, which is like very, very low level in terms of like, don't buy the coffee, like bring your own, take your own lunch to work and stuff like that. And while that's helpful for some people that are maybe very extravagant in that space, or maybe spending £10 a day on coffee across a week, of course that compounds, across a month, of course that compounds. It depends on like what percentage of your income that is. But I know that you've got a 2x rule. Can you share that with me just now?
Yeah, so the 2x rule is just a simple rule to kind of get rid of spending guilt. And so anytime you want to splurge on yourself, now for every person, a splurge is different. For one person, $100 might be a splurge. For someone else, it might be 10,000. Whatever you consider a splurge is a splurge. But basically, the idea is very simple to get rid of spending guilt. If you're going to go spend, let's say, $500 on yourself, like you want to take a spa day, or you want to buy a new guitar, or whatever it is, you save $500 for that thing. And then you save another 500, 2x the original amount, and then you invest that money, or you donate it, or you do something else with it. You do something that's benefiting either yourself, your future self, or you're benefiting someone else. So you kind of get rid of that spending guilt. So if you're ever like, oh, I really shouldn't spend $1,000 on this thing, well, then save another 1,000 and say, okay, well, if I'm gonna spend 1,000 on this, I'm gonna take that other 1,000 and invest it in an S&P 500 index fund, or a global stock index fund, or I'm going to take this 1,000, I'm going to donate it to a cause I care about. Whatever works for you. I'm just trying to get people to get out of guilt, because a lot of the mainstream financial media, a lot of the messaging is built around guilt in one way or another, and I don't want to guilt people. I don't think stress is good. I've read a lot on stress. There's a great book by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Get Ulcers, and it's a very long book, very in depth, but it talks a lot about stress. And I think minimizing stress is one of the most important things you can do to kind of stay in the game and not get burnt out and stuff like that. So I would say try to minimize stress as much as possible, and financial decisions are a big area of stress. And so the book, on top of time on investments, how to build your wealth and all that, it's also trying to get you to like psychologically be in a good spot and with how you think about your money.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I enjoyed about it the most, because while you're an incredibly data-driven guy, not acknowledging the part that the mind and the body plays when it comes to our decisions and these things, like you say, with stress, in terms of limiting our lifespan and limiting our quality of life, that's absolutely massive. And I think where you can have little rules in place where you can feel better about that bigger output by maybe foolproofing your future self or supporting a cause that you care about, it's a really nice way to balance things within your brain. Because I think a lot of people that listen to a podcast like this, which is based on self-development and being your best self, you can absolutely be your own harshest critic. And if you, like you say, have a splurge where, I don't know, maybe you go out for a really expensive meal. I know you're a bit of a foodie, Nick, and you drop however much on it. You're like, God, like that was just that one experience. I don't feel like I've earned this to spend on that. So if you were to balance it out by investing double into the market, it might reassure that critic inside your head that actually it's going to be okay. Like I've covered my bases here.
Exactly right, and it's all about what you do mentally. For example, me going out in New York City, spending $200 at a dinner, I don't consider that a splurge. That's like a nicer meal, but it's not over the top. Like a splurge meal is going to be over like $300, maybe more, right? And so maybe $400. I think that for me is like that's the splurge point because that's when you're like really going to a really really nice place, right? And so I don't do that often. So I don't think about like, oh, I spent $110 here at this meal, I need to go and save 110. No, I don't think like that. But anytime I do like go for a really really nice meal, I will kind of think about, hey, maybe I should save extra to kind of get rid of my guilt over this, and I'll then take extra money out of something and just invest it in. So that's kind of how I like to think about it.
Is that one of the main things that you spend on, Nick, that might generate guilt?
No, I'm trying to think of when anytime I used to buy like, fancy dress shoes, that was a big one for me. I was always like, do I really need this? I don't know, but it's like, you want to look nice and stuff. So it's like, that was worth anything. Like restaurants I love, so I don't really feel much guilt about spending money there. And I like, especially after what happened with COVID, like I really just like, I'm a big supporter of hospitality workers and stuff because it's like a very thankless job. But so for me, I don't really look at like, oh, it's a big splurge. It really isn't for me. But there's other areas in my life like fashion, things like that, where I'm like, do I really want to spend this? And that's kind of where the splurge stuff might come into me,
Yeah. So when you 2x on those, it kind of reassures you like, okay, that happened, but I'm covering the future for Nick to be happy when he's older.
Yeah. Exactly.
One of my favorite quotes from your book is, when deciding between investing all your money now or over time, it's almost always better to invest now. This is true across all asset classes, time periods, and nearly all valuation regimes. Generally, the longer you deploy your capital, the worse off you. The longer you wait to deploy your capital, the worse off you will be. Now, that really speaks to people who wish to like time the market, doesn't it? They're like, oh, I'll invest when this happens, or when that happens, or when I see this particular price on this stock or this particular coin.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, like, people that are buying right now that had held off previously, would they be able to argue with you that because they're lumping in now, are they getting more for their money than if they'd started lumping in, say, at the end of 2021?
Well, I mean, clearly they are getting a better deal because the market's down, right? So like the market's down, whatever, 20% or whatever it is. So they're getting all else equal, they're getting a discount relative to buying in, let's say, December 2021. So I agree with that. But at the same time, like, those things are rare. Like, yes, you're using an example now that's true. It's recent, very recent example. And it's a very like, oh, haha, gotcha. But it's like, what about every other year? If we start going back, what about December 2020? What about December 2019? What about December 2018? People have been saying the market's overvalued since 2012. Since I started investing, I've been reading about it. Since I started writing, I've seen it much more because I've been reading a lot more in the news. And like, since 2017, people said market's overvalued, market's overvalued. They've been saying it for forever, and it's been 5 years now. And now we finally have a crash. I mean, besides the COVID crash, which I think made sense in its own right, this crash is a little different. And it's like, now we're having a crash, and now they're taking their victory lap. But it's like, how many? It's like I won the last 9 out of the 10 years, right? And I'm even if this thing lasts another 5 years, let's say we don't hit a new all-time high for 5 years, I don't think that invalidates the thesis. I think most of the time I've tested periods, I use rolling periods, I've done in every asset class, and generally most assets go up over time because of inflation, because of a host of things, right? Otherwise, why would you be buying them, right? It's like the thing about the premise of investing, right? The whole premise of like, I'm buying this thing because I expect it to go up, right? Why else? You don't buy it because you expect it to go down. That's silly. You'd be a crazy person, right? So that's out. So you don't expect it to go down. You expect it to go up, but you expect it to go up in a way such that you're going to, in case it doesn't go up, you're going to buy. And it's like, the premise is just wrong, right? So it's okay if you're right now, because I think following that strategy over the long term, you're going to lose. That's the difference, right? So those people who said, hey, I'm buying over time, like if they started, instead of like investing all of it, let's say January 1st of 2022, they say, I'm just going to invest it every month over the next year. In most years they would lose. In this year they're winning, and that's great. But guess what? If they keep following those strategies for forever, for like the next 20, 30 years, I can almost guarantee that strategy is going to underperform a strategy where they just put it all in as soon as they have the money.
Yeah,
so that's the difference, right?
I was very keen to play devil's advocate there with you, Nick, to get you fired up and going. So that was fun. I completely agree. Like, you may have timed it right now and have this recency bias, but like you say, people have been saying for so long, like, oh, like these stocks are a bubble, the S&P 500 is overvalued. Like, why is this the case? And I think people who are traditionally have that pessimistic nature, they like to say, I told you so. It's the same as like in the US you call it soccer, here we call it football. Like a lot of people are always desperate when like a new signing comes into a football club, like, oh, I don't really rate him. And if it turns out that he doesn't do well, they're delighted because they can say I told you so. But if he does well, they're able to be like, oh well, like I'm glad he did well. And it's the same for like the stock market. You can be like, oh, it's, or like a particular coin, you're like, oh, it's going to zero, or this is overpriced. And if it does well, financially you're benefiting. But if it goes to zero, you get the kind of the gratitude and the elation to be like, oh well, I was right this whole time, and my contrarian or like negative position was reinforced. But if people walk through life like that, it's going to add to that S word that you used earlier, that stress, where they just constantly being negative about the things that they're involved in.
Yeah, and the other thing too is you have to make a lot of calls, and you have to like compare your calls to what, because no one's perfect with forecasts. Even there are people that have like, there's some evidence that there's some of these super forecasters that can actually do decently well. The problem is a lot of people, I mean, I've read this, I can't remember, I can find that article again. There's an article where they went through all the financial pundits and looked at all their calls. And I know they say stuff, they like talk trash on Jim Cramer because he gets everything wrong. It's not actually true. He's about 47% accurate. So he's like, I remember, and this was in this study over this time period. I don't know. I haven't looked at his stuff since then, right? So I don't know. But at the time, he was 47% accurate. So he's basically a coin flip, right? And it's tough. I don't expect him to know that. He's an entertainment figure. For you to judge him on this stuff, it's like, so to me, it's silly because he's clearly there for entertainment. He doesn't actually know the future. And there were some pundits who actually did really well, right? And so some do well, some don't. There could be luck there. You have to really look at their long history, their track record over a long period of time, and say, hey, are they better than chance or not? And if they're equal to chance, and it's basically anyone can make predictions, right? But it's like they're just more entertaining when they do it, right? And so there's value to that, even if there's no value in their picks, right? So I'm not trying to hate on Jim Cramer for all this, but I just feel like a lot of people will find every time he's wrong and point it out. It's like, he's been right at times. He definitely has been. Otherwise, like we wouldn't be here. If he's 100% wrong, you could short him, right? In theory. And so people have tried to do that, right? But it's like one of those funny little things there. So I'd be like, hey, I want someone to do I might actually do this myself. I might go get all of his picks, do an analysis to see how many times he was right and wrong, and see like defend him or do something like that. I mean, it might be interesting to do that. So
yeah, that'd be a good article to read. And I think to put a pin in that particular area, I think one of the common questions you get is when people are like, oh, I've come into like this money, or like say I hit my bonus in work and I get this particular lump sum, rather than like you say, even choosing to dollar cost average across a period of time, it's better to just get it into the market, because kind of famous Warren Buffett quote is that timing the market is better than trying to time the market. So you might as well chuck it in there. And if you're in it for the long game, like you said, over a 20, 30 year period, it's not going to matter whether you bought in December 2021 or whether you bought in March 2022 when things started to go south. Now, it remains a bit of a dirty word in my vocabulary, Nick, and it gets a little bit of a visceral reaction, but I know that you've got a more measured take on debt. What is that?
Well, I mean, I would say debt, as I say in the book, is debt isn't good or bad. It's just really how you use it. And I think if there's one overarching principle, it's like the people who are best equipped to use debt are those who don't need it. And so you can think of, I can use a very extreme example, Elon Musk, who at one point, I don't know if he's still doing this, but he basically pledged his Tesla stock as like collateral, and then he borrowed against it at super low rates because rates were super low. And he's obviously the richest man in the world. Which bank wouldn't be happy to give him money, right? And so he didn't have to sell his Tesla stock, right? And he didn't have to sell anything. He didn't have to sell any assets to fund his lifestyle, right? So he got to keep these assets, which could, in theory, keep appreciating, and they have kept appreciating. Not forever, but still more than if he had sold back, 5-6 years ago. Obviously, those assets are much larger now. So that's an example of someone who didn't need debt. Obviously, he clearly didn't need debt, but he was able to use it because he said, hey, what's more likely? Am I likely to earn a return higher than whatever 1% or 2%, whatever he was paying to the bank? Probably. And so that's, for him, was a great idea. And I think it's the same thing is true if you can afford to like pay for a house cash, like just straight up cash and buy a house, I think it would make sense to like actually consider getting debt if you can get a decent rate, and it's like, because you can just let that thing inflate over time. What's going to happen is, assume your income goes up over time, your payment's fixed. So like, for example, in the book, I talk about this. My grandparents bought a house in California for $27,000 back in like 1972, which is very cheap. But 10 years later, by 1982, due to all the inflation in the 70s, their payment in real terms was cut in half. So let's just assume my grandfather, he was the only one working, my grandmother stayed at home. Let's assume my grandfather, his pay was pegged such that he was pegged to inflation. Let's just assume he is. I have no idea. I'm not going to ask him his income history or anything, but let's just assume he matched inflation. 10 years later, he's now, his rent is half, or sorry, his mortgage payment was half of what it was 10 years prior. And that's huge. I mean, how many times, like if I think about like how much I'm paying, obviously I've had roommates and stuff, but even if I control for that, like my rent has only gone up. It has not stayed fixed since even if we control for like if I had my own place or whatever and how much I would have paid, like I'm definitely paying a bit more than I would have paid back in 2012 when I first started living on my own.
That's probably one of the most interesting arguments in favor of buying versus renting if you're going to maybe stay in that particular location, because you can lock in your cost of living. Whereas, like, for example, I think I've got a 5-year fixed mortgage at just over 1%. So really, 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 really good. But like you say, your rent would probably get adjusted, particularly during this period where gas, electric bills, things like that are going up. Landlords are tending to push up their rental costs as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so I think the main thing there is like, I think you have to be at a place for at least 10 years. That's what I say. Of course, there's so many individual factors. Like with real estate, it's like basically what you're doing is like you're putting, let's say you're buying a $400,000 house, right? You're putting $400,000 into like a single stock, but that single stock is a physical property, right? You don't get to like diversify and own every neighborhood in the United States and have just a little slice of everything. It's like you to put it all into one property, and so the local real estate dynamics are incredibly important for that single property, right? It's just like buying, like putting $400,000 into Apple, and then you have like no other exposure to stocks. It would just be like, of course I would have done well over the last 5 years, but let's say you picked a stock that didn't do well. So you put Peloton, it's a very different thing, So I think that's a thing to keep in mind. It's like obviously a very important decision. There's so many different dynamics at play. And so the whole rent versus buy thing, I don't think that question's ever going to be solved definitively, because there's so many individual factors which can sway it one way or another. And as the factors change, as interest rates change, as local market dynamics change, as buyers and sellers, who's in the market. I mean, historically, most people who bought homes were just individuals. Now in the United States, we have big investment companies. I think like Blackstone buying all these houses. So it's like now who's buying is even different. So that changes the dynamics of the market. So things are going to change over time. And because of that, like we're never going to have a definitive buy versus rent. You should always buy or always rent type of thing. It's going to matter for your local market. That's the truth. But I try and provide some guidelines that generally would work even when I don't know your local situation.
Agreed. I think that was a really intriguing part of the book as well, and I think it's a debate that's going to continue to rage on, because particularly like my generation coming through school and university, it was very much get your degree, get your grad job. When you have enough money, put your deposit down for your flat or your house, depending if you're in a relationship or not. Get the house with your partner, all that kind of stuff. And it was very much like get your roots down. Whereas a lot of the personal finance advice that I've listened to in the last 2-3 years has been a lot more open-minded to renting based on location and circumstances. And it's interesting the way that you discussed, like if you had that lump sum available to buy a property outright, you might be better off with debt, because the money that you are using to service that, or like you've left over, putting that into the market, you're probably going to get a better return versus the amount that you're paying versus the mortgage, the mortgage and the interest. Very, very interesting concept. Any other areas for debt that you'd want to explore that you think are important? Obviously, that's a very good example in terms of like people taking on debt for houses. What other areas?
I think housing, private mortgages are the big one that people talk about the most. And some of the research, as I discussed in Just Keep Buying, it's like most people, there's no stress around mortgage debt. If you look at types of debt and how it affects people's like psyches and how they feel and stuff, mortgage debt does not register. It's just like, oh, that's something I'm going to have for 30 years. No one thinks about it like they think about credit card debt or other types of debt. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. There are certain people, however, there's a subset of the population that hates debt altogether, and they could not stand debt, even mortgage debt. So if you're one of these people, maybe a mortgage is not right for you. So you kind of have to know yourself a little bit. But yeah, for most people, it's not a big deal. The only other types of debt that, I can think about, the other big ones, is like student loan debt. That's something where, and I know people talk a lot of, trash on, going to college and having student loan debt, and I get it. I think for a lot of people, it still makes sense. The question is it going to raise your earnings more than not having the degree? That's the question, right? And we have to kind of model that. I have a formula in there you can use to try and figure this out, right? It's never perfect, but it's like, okay, without the degree, you have to kind of guess here's what my expected earnings would be. With the degree, here's how much. You take that amount, you discount it back. I have a formula I give, as I say, and you try and figure out, okay, that's how much it's worth, so I should be willing to pay up to this much for this degree, right? And so for most undergraduate degrees, most of the debt actually isn't there. If you actually look at most of the debt that people, or at least people who have large balances, that usually comes from, at least in the United States, comes from master's and grad programs, right? That's where, law school, medical school, that's where like debt really starts to shoot up. That's where you get people with $300,000 in debt. I very rarely hear about someone who got out of undergrad with like $100K in debt. It's very rare. It does happen, but it's rare. Most people who get out of there, the debt loads are much smaller. You look at the data on this and they're much smaller, much more manageable, something like 30 to 40K, which, don't get me wrong, that's still a lot of money, but it's not 100, 200, 300. I hear about people getting out of a master's program and it's like, oh, I got my master's in education and I have 300 grand in debt. It's like, that is a whole other animal. That's like a lot of money, right? And people don't realize that. So I think you have to think about those decisions before you do it. And you're like, well, I really love education. Well, it's like, yeah, you love education, but how much do you love like having a hampered lifestyle because of having $300,000 in debt, And you have to do the research and make sure you're not having negative amortizing loan where you're just paying interest and the loan is growing. Or you're like, what, I've been paying for 10 years and you're telling me I haven't paid off anything. It's like, yeah, because you're paying neg am loan. You need to do your research on the type of loan you have. I don't think it's fair. I personally think neg am loan should be illegal. That's my policy opinion. I don't think they should be allowed, but if in that case, there would be people who just couldn't afford to pay their loans at all, right? And they would default. But it's one of those things where like, I don't think people understand the payment. They understand, hey, you're gonna have to pay this. If you can't pay this, like, then you shouldn't even go and do this program. Like, you got to kind of tell people up front and be much more transparent. A lot of these banks don't want to do that because they're just trying to earn whatever they can. So I don't agree with a lot of the neg am stuff, but at the same time, you kind of have to, you're signing a contract you're saying, hey, I'm gonna take out this loan. Like, you got to kind of be somewhat responsible for that too, even though you're younger and stuff. We got to try, and it's a little bit on both sides. So I don't want to blame completely personal responsibility. I know banks have done a lot of tricky stuff and really shady stuff there, and they are partially responsible. At the same time, there needs to be some personal responsibility here. Like, people, I wouldn't have taken out one of those loans. I know a bunch of people that I know wouldn't have done those, but some people just really want something and they're like, hey, I don't care the price. I want to get my master's. And
a lack of financial literacy as well, Nick, where like they've not considered what that means. I think the consideration of whether this piece of paper, this degree, this qualification is going to open me up to greater earning power is the biggest and hardest calculation before somebody considers how much debt that's going to work out at. Because like you say, if it does open the door to significantly better earning power, then 20, 30, 40,000 pounds worth of debt is extremely serviceable because you're going to earn more across the course of your lifetime. And that continues to be the case, although university and college, like you say, is getting a very bad rap, particularly online and communities that I mix in as well. People dismiss university very, very quickly, but there is a reason that a lot of people still put stock in that 3-4 year period where you gain a qualification, you gain a set of skills that makes you valuable to particular sectors of the employment market. Like, I know that jobs that I've had, the degree, the 2-1 from a particular institution was the piece of paper that you absolutely had to have to even interview. There's obviously apprentice programs and different pathways, but for me, it was like, do you have a degree? Yeah, fantastic. Where's it from? What's it in? What's your grade? Okay, cool. You passed this part of the screening, especially when you've got so many applicants and so many competitive jobs. It's a filter for particular roles where you can earn a particular amount of money. So I do find that very interesting. And it links into my next question, where how does the generation that we come from or we're born into shape our different biases that we have towards investing?
I mean, I think at least for most people, a lot of their money beliefs and things are going to be based on, how they grew up with their family, their parents, things like that will pass down money beliefs in just little ways. For example, I just talked about how, I'm a foodie. I go out, spend, what I would consider, or what many would consider exorbitant amounts of money on restaurants, right? At the same time, every time I go to McDonald's, I order off the dollar menu, like every single time, even though like I regularly would drop, orders of magnitude more at another restaurant. When I go to McDonald's, I order off the dollar menu. Why is that? Because my father and my mother, every time I went, oh, you have to order off the dollar menu. And I always did. And so to this day, it's like, I have to feel like I have to order off that, even though I can clearly afford the $5 sandwich, I still order the, the $1.20 McDouble or whatever it is. Right. And so it's like thinking like that and how that affects people. And so that's one piece of it, is like your upbringing, how that affects you. But the second thing is like what happens in the market during the first, 5 to 10 years. Imagine you started investing in 2022. You're like, wow, this is really, I'm going to start this. I've seen all this wealth created from all these people. You get invested, you're just getting wrecked right now. And let's say this continues for another couple of years, like markets just stay flat. Let's say they kind of go sideways. You're going to feel very differently than somebody started investing in 2012 like I did, because I've seen the power of wealth. Like I just put money in this thing and in this box, and this box gave me more money back. Like, it's crazy, right? It just, if you think of it in just a very abstract terms, but then you say someone like, wait, I put money in and I lose this is a scam, right? And know history. They haven't studied that. They haven't seen like, wow, here's what would have happened if I invested here. And there's obviously tough periods. There's a lot of tough periods in the stock market. There's a reason why this thing grows so much wealth, is because there's so many periods where it doesn't grow wealth and where people are like, give up hope. And that's the whole idea, right? It's like they're going to beat down stocks and give up hope. And as a result, the people who still believe and care and really think businesses are going to produce profits and earnings and all this stuff and growth, they will reap the rewards. So
yeah, exactly that. I think we all have our biases, like you say, from upbringing particularly, but particularly at periods of time when you're born, I find, or even when you get acquainted with the market, because you could have got acquainted with the market at 30 years old this year because you'd never really thought about it before, and you're like, holy shit, this thing's hard. Whereas if you got acquainted with the market at 18, like 2 years ago, you're like, oh, this is cool. Like I've had 2 great years, like especially 2021, which I know I've heard you say before, like it was actually hard to work out how 2021 was such a good year when you consider all the factors that were going on around the world as well. So yeah, I find it fascinating that when you entered into the market and like what age you're born in and what's going on in terms of like society at that period of time has a massive shape towards that. Alongside age, you also wrote about luck, and I guess it can be luck in terms of what period you're born in as well.
Of course, yeah. Luck is going to dominate a good portion of, I mean, at least when you first enter the market, that's all luck. Like you have no idea. Like I was born in 1989. So when I turned 18, it was like 2008. Right. And it's like, I just happened to be like, I wasn't investing. I didn't have any money. I was in college. Right. So I kind of spent 4 years in college during the toughest market of our generation, which was arguably 08 to, let's say 2010, that rough period. So I was in college, so I just lucked out to be in a place where I didn't need to worry about money in the same way, right? And I also had a very generous scholarship from my school and all that. So like I got incredibly lucky. I'm one of the luckiest kids in America, right? I really mean that in terms of that. But came in 2012, and market's been basically straight up ever since until recently. And so it's like that I just happened to walk into that, into a very good time period to be investing. So that's gonna obviously affect how I think about things. I say just keep buying because it worked for 10 years. And of course, I don't just use 2012 onward. My book goes back. We go back to 1926. We run all sorts of analyses, rolling periods. I'm not just using recency bias. Of course, that helps, but I've experienced it personally. But I've had to look through history and like show, hey, even if you had done this in different periods, you still would have built wealth. And you should have been diversified in all these types of things.
Yeah, I think the acknowledgement of luck is absolutely massive, but you can start to remove luck from the equation with that longer term time frame. Like you said, like if people are starting investing now, of course it's a bit sore, but you're probably glad that you started now in 20, 30 years time. Because are we realistically saying that humanity and society and our economy is not going to progress until 2050?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you would really hope not. If you think that, then you really are betting against the kind of evolution of the human race from that perspective.
Yeah, of course. And of course, things don't always get better. There are dark periods that happen. You can think of the Great Depression. You can even think of right now, the war with, Russia and Ukraine. That's, it's not a great thing. It's messing up supply chains. A lot of the grain for the world comes out of Ukraine. That's causing food riots. All sorts of issues are happening because of that. And that's not a good thing for the world, let alone Ukraine, right? So you have to think about that. And so, of course, there are going to be periods like that. There's going to be other wars. Is there going to be another world war? I hope not. I hope never again, right? I hope there's no skirmishes at all, right? But of course, that's maybe not realistic. I hope anything is like that's going to happen in the future are these small scale things, which are hopefully, less devastating than what we saw in the 20th century with World War I and World War II. So who knows what's going to happen, but that's kind of, we just have to wait and see. And during those periods, it's tough. It's tough to be an investor to imagine like, wow, this is really a bad time. But like, we get through it. And so I generally think things are getting better. But of course, there's always these steps backwards that happen, and they will continue to happen, right? So it's not a straight perfect line upward, just like markets. It's like human progress has drawdowns, right? There are declines in progress, I would say, it doesn't go up forever. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, agreed. But if we can try and keep level, that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
In February 2021, your godfather texted you calling you paper hands. Why was that?
He called me paper hands because I sold some of my Bitcoin. I owned one Bitcoin at the time, and in February 2021, I sold half of it, and I tweeted out, sold half my Bitcoin, ask me anything. And then I told I was down in California at the time. I was down there for a funeral, unfortunately, due to COVID. And I told him I sold my Bitcoin. And so then he starts watching the price. And he didn't know what Bitcoin was 2 days before. But so he starts watching the price, 2 days later, and I taught him paper. I told him the whole culture and all this stuff. And so he didn't know what this was, right? And so then like 2 days later, he just sends me a screenshot because the price had been up. I sold it like 52,000, sold half my Bitcoin. And then he sent me a screenshot and he said, paper hands Maggiulli. And so then it just became a joke. And all these people, I was getting dunked on so badly for that.
Twitter
I
was
actually
not
love it.
happy with you. Crypto Twitter was angry.
Yeah, well, because I mean, it was crazy. It was like, 3 months prior, the price was, 16, 17,000, whatever it was. And then all of a sudden it's at 52. I'm like, this is wild. I have to rebalance. This went from 2% of my portfolio to 8% or whatever it was. I said, I'm selling half of this. I'm going to keep the other half. And I haven't sold it or touched it since. And it's been basically in my tolerance range of, 1 to 3%. And it's been in that range ever since. And if it gets out of that range, I'll buy more. If it goes above that range, I'll sell more. And that's it. It's really a rebalancing thing. That was it. I wasn't trying to make any future guess about the future of crypto. Now, obviously right now it's like, because Bitcoin, I don't know what it's at, 20,000, whatever it's at now. It looks like I was some sort of genius or something. It's not genius. It's literally just a rebalancing tolerance. That's all it was. But people took it as like this big attack on crypto and Bitcoin. I was like, no, it's just crazy. I made tons of money very quickly. And I just said, hey, I need to hedge my risk a little bit. And looking back now, even if all my crypto right now were to go to zero, and even with the other losses I've had on these altcoins, as I talked about previously, I've still made a considerable amount of money because of that. Just from that single trade, I've made more money than all the money I would possibly lose in crypto, right? And so it's just something to think about. It's like, if you can do something like that once in a while, I'm basically betting on crypto for free at this point, right? It's like all my money is just, I've had more gains than I will ever have losses.
Yeah, and that's a great position to be in. I think you shared the story about your friend paying off his medical bills with his gains from crypto, or maybe it was university fees.
Yeah, medical bills. Friend of a friend went to medical school, launched his own coin, didn't do incredible, but did enough so he could pay off his medical bills. It's great. And then he took some of that money. He's been rolling to different coins, been making money, put it into the whole Terra Luna thing. I can't remember if he owned Luna or Terra, whatever it was, just wiped him out. So he still he got medical school for free. You should just at least be happy for that. That's, of all the things he did, he got medical school for free. Yes, he lost some money. He probably would have been better off if he'd just been buying the S&P 500 over time. But hey, this is the game. And, you got to, if you want to make a big bucks, you got to play, and, there's risk. And this is the risk kind of manifesting itself. Interestingly,
you upset Twitter when you told them that you were selling Bitcoin, but you also upset them when you told them you were buying more Ethereum at 2K. What do we learn from these sort of experiences when Twitter reacts to when you're buying and when you're selling?
It doesn't matter. Anytime you talk about crypto, you're going to find everyone who's opposed to that idea is going to dunk on you. So in the case of when I sold Bitcoin, it was all the crypto people saying I was an idiot. And when I bought Ethereum at 2K, it's now, I think, below that or pretty close to that, or I don't know where it's at right now. Actually, maybe I think it's 1,000 or something. I don't know what the price is exactly, but right now, so I'm losing on my Ethereum trade, but I'm winning big on my Bitcoin trade, right? I've won big on my Bitcoin trade. And so it's just one of those things where like a lot of people just dunked on me and like, oh, it's going lower. And actually from then the price went up a ton actually. And so my trade, both of those trades look really good, but now obviously the market's turned and now crypto's down bad. And so I think I'm actually losing money pretty confident. I've lost money on the Ethereum trade if I were to sell today, but I still hold it. I don't have any plans to sell. I'm going to hold it and just see if I need to rebalance into it or not in the next rebalance I do.
Yeah, rebalancing is a very interesting term, and it was pretty new to me when I was reading your book, and then of course reading your content around you fighting with the Bitcoin maxis on Twitter. What is the process for rebalancing, and how often do you do it?
There's different ways you can do this. For example, and a lot of this has to do with taxes. So in the US, I don't know what it's like in, other places, but just the thing to remember is anytime you sell an investment as a gain, you have to pay taxes, right? So I try not to sell. So the type of rebalance I do, at least in my taxable accounts, is called an accumulation rebalance. And what that just means is, well, imagine I have stocks. Imagine I only have two assets. I'll make this very simple, right? 60% stocks, 40% bonds, right? Let's say after a year, it's 70% stocks, 30% bonds. Traditionally, a rebalance would sell some of the stocks and buy some of the bonds back. So we're back in our 60-40 kind of balance, right? But if you're doing that taxable account, there could be any sort of like taxes you have to owe on capital gains. The better thing to do, I believe, is say, okay, we're at 70-30. I should just buy enough bonds until we're back at 60-40. So it's like, just if you have extra cash or when you're investing consistently, just keep throwing money into the underweight assets. So you kind of keep it around 60-40 over time. That's the idea. So that's only with the two asset portfolio. As you have more assets, it gets a little more complex, but you can say, here's my ideal weights. Okay, then how much do I need to add or subtract from everything? And obviously there's different types of accounts. So you can take your non-taxable accounts, your retirement accounts, rebalance some way in there, and then offset elsewhere so that your whole portfolio is in balance, even though your taxable, it's a little more complex. It's like, it's more art than science, but that's kind of the idea. Ideally, I'd want you never to have to sell anything and just to keep buying of all the things that are underweight. That's the ideal thing. But at some point, you're not gonna be able to do that. If you have a $10 million portfolio and things are moving in a big way, you may not have, I have to put $500,000. I don't have 500K to put into this, right? That's an extreme example, but it shows that at some point you may not be able to do an accumulation rebalance. But for most people, they should be able to at least.
And for you, when Bitcoin went from 8K to 52, there's no way that you could have balanced out the rest of your portfolio by buying that percentage of gain because it literally rocketed.
Yeah. So let's just pretend, I'm just going to make this very simple. Let's say my portfolio at the time was, I'm just going to make the math simple. Let's say 8%. Let's say that was 1% of my portfolio. Let's say I had $800,000, right? So if it goes from 8 to 52, that means my portfolio would have to go from 800,000 to $5 million, right? So the only way I can offset that, remember, and this is a course of, less than a year. So I need to come up with $4 million to put into other assets to get the Bitcoin back down. And I don't have $4 million in cash, right? This is obviously not realistic. So in those cases, because it was so extreme, it was easier for me to sell half of it. And that would get it closer to a more fair, allocation, right? More within a tolerance range that I was comfortable with at the time. And so that's basically what I did. And so that's what happens. At one point, 8%, $8,000 was whatever percent of my portfolio it was. But I'm just giving you a very extreme example of that.
Yeah, it's a great example, Nick. You mentioned that when you rebalance, that's one of the times that you would sell. In the book, you mentioned 2 other cases. What are those?
So rebalancing is one. If you need to get out of a concentrated position or a losing position, sometimes if you realize that was an example of a concentrated position. I was far more concentrated in Bitcoin than I wanted to be, so I sold out of it. Another thing is a losing position. I used to own gold for a long time, and I've started doing that, looking at the history, and it's like gold can have 20-year periods where it loses money on real terms. And I was like, I would not be able to sit with this thing for 20 years while it lost money after inflation. That seems crazy to me. Very few income producing assets do that. So this is not for me. So I got out of gold. So that was an example of when to sell. The third time when to sell is when you need the money to live your life, right? Like at the end of the day, the whole point of doing this is so you can live the life you want. We're not just accumulating dollars to accumulate dollars, right? And so at some point, especially if you're in retirement, for example, you're going to need to sell down assets at times, and you're going to need to sell down for, maybe you have to pay for a child's wedding, or you need to get a vacation home, whatever it is, you're going to have to sell assets at some point. And there's nothing wrong with selling assets, even though the book's called Just Keep Buying. There are times when it's okay to sell. And that's kind of the point here, just trying to remind people about that.
Yeah, I think from a, like you say, a tax perspective and even a fees perspective within your apps and your brokerages, it's disadvantageous to sell regularly, and trying to time that selling is also hard as well. So no wonder people that were really big on Bitcoin, and I hold a good percentage of Bitcoin as well. It went to 69, so they're like, oh, but look at all that stuff off the top that you missed. Be like, well, actually, I'd already run my race, I already won, so I'm not too bothered. So trying to time when you sell as well is extremely, extremely difficult. One of the last areas I wanted to go with you, Nick, was I recently interviewed a gentleman called Thomas Erickson, who wrote a book called Surrounded by Idiots. It's based on the DISC system by Carl Jung, and it's all about personality types and how we're aligned. Do you think there's particular personality types that are more predisposed to being able to follow your philosophy of just keeping buying, or can we all achieve it?
I haven't done much research on this. I'm guessing any sort of personality type, I'm guessing there's some correlation here. If your personality allows you to rely on evidence and evidence-based arguments, I don't know. There's going to be people out there that need that. There are going to be people out there that want the answer to come from someone who just sounds confident. Those are very different personality types, right? One is more of I need some great person to tell me what to do. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say, here's the evidence. Here's what I think is most likely to happen. And so if your personality type is very open to that idea, then you're more likely to follow the advice. I do think it's for everyone, but of course, there are going to be people that are going to believe in, oh, there's someone that can beat the market. And I know there's someone out there that can beat the market. And there are people that can beat the market. I will be the first to tell you that. I just think they're rare. They're hard to find. And they're going to be hard for you to identify before a fact, right? And so because they're hard to identify beforehand, you shouldn't waste time on it. Just buy the whole index, buy the market, and just let the chips fall where they may, and spend your time on, things that are more useful and suited to your strengths and trying to pick a best investment manager, pick this or that. And so I think that's my main takeaway here. And so obviously that's not going to resonate with everyone, and that's fine, because we still need active stock pickers. We need people out there trying to do this other stuff. And honestly, I mean, to say this is going to sound very cynical, but we need people out there making investment mistakes. Otherwise, financial writers like myself would have no jobs, right? So we have nothing fun to write about. So that's what I'm saying. Like, you need to do that, right? And there's nothing wrong with taking 1%, 5%, 10% of your portfolio and making these bets. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's when you start doing a very large percentage of your portfolio is when it can get kind of scary, because if you mess up, you can literally go to zero, and it's very unlikely that a index investor will go to zero. And so that's the difference here, is like there's no kind of edge cases where you go belly up. I mean, it's very unlikely, right? Unless you're using leverage or something like that, but it's very unlikely.
Agreed. I found it fascinating speaking to Thomas, and I've done some personality tests with my corporate job, and then away from that, I did Jordan Peterson's Understand Me as well. And it is interesting how my personality type is, like, part of it's cool blue, which is in line with analytical, data driven. It's part of the reason that I find like the elements of my kind of fitness lifestyle quite enjoyable, because it's very process driven, and you follow the process and you tick the boxes and you use the information and the science and you apply it. It overlaps with investing over a long period of time as well, because you're kind of like, oh, well, I can see where it's going. Like, I can see the history of the market. Like you say, past performance is not always an indicator of future performance, but it's one of the only indications that we've got in terms of where things might end up. So I found that fascinating. Understanding how I'm wired and how some people are wired might predispose them to being able to listen to sources like you and be like, I get where Nick's coming from. I understand what he's saying, and I can follow this advice through.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, is that the one where there's like blue, green, yellow, red? Is that the one? Yeah. So I did this once, and I was like I was max blue, green, like both, right? Green's very admin oriented, very ordered, I think, if I remember correctly. And I was like maxed on both blue and green. And yellow is like entrepreneur stuff. The yellow people, those are the stock pickers. Those are the people that are trying to go out and do their own stuff. And so, yeah, the yellow people in this case are not going to really, the entrepreneurial, creative mindset. Those people aren't going to find much fun in this very uncreative, boring approach to getting building wealth. But the question is, do you want to be right, or do you want to get rich? And that's the question. Like, it's ultimately, I only care about building wealth, right? That's what I care about. I think that's the ultimate sense of power you're going to have in your life, is having wealth and having the freedom to do what you want. And I think this is the best way to do it, when knowing nothing else about you. If I just had to give someone like, 3 words, I say, just keep buying. If I give them a sentence, it's the continual purchase of income producing assets. If I have to give them more, I give them the book, right? So you can see how this all kind of plays in on itself. And that's the thing I would say, right? So without knowing anything else about you, because I just give the book, right? And obviously from there, you can then kind of figure, I need to focus on this or that. And that's kind of what the book's built around.
Yeah, exactly, Nick. I'm a big fan of it, and I've loved getting to know your work in the last couple of months, and I'm excited to see what else comes next for you. If people want to continue the conversation, where should they head towards?
You can find me on Twitter at Dollars and Data. That's one place. I try to respond to all my DMs, so feel free to DM me. I think I haven't missed one yet, hopefully. And you can find my blog of dollarsandData.com, and you can find the book Just Keep Buying on Amazon and other places where it's sold.
Yeah, fantastic, Nick. That'll be linked in the show notes below. Thank you very much for joining me, Nick. And thank you to you, the listener, for tuning in as always. Nick's super responsive, as he said. That's the blue part of his personality. He likes to be very thorough. So he's going to tick those boxes, and he's going to come back to you. And I'm sure you've got lots of different questions for him. And I'll be back to speak to you all again very